Please take your Bible and turn to Revelation chapter 7. We're studying the things that the Apostle John was shown in a series of visions to share with the followers of Yeshua regarding future events that will suddenly come to pass someday. Not only so we'll know what's going to happen, but also to reaffirm our faith if or when we see these things come to pass in our lifetime. In chapter 4, verse 1, John heard a voice that told him, "Come up here, and I will show you things which must be hereafter." And this voice was Yeshua's voice, inviting John to come up to heaven, to be shown what's going to happen. And from here all the way till the end of the book, we will be studying these future events. And we need to remember that whenever John begins a new section, it doesn't always necessarily indicate a change from one period of time to the next. Sometimes it's a change in subject matter, or a change in point of view, or just giving us additional information. It seems that his visions skip around on a giant mural rather than just going straight through a timeline chart. And eventually, a clear view of the whole picture will be easier for us to see. And there is a general time sequence in the events of the seals and the trumpets and the plagues and the bowls of wrath and so on, but they're not always in strict chronological order. Sometimes we get an overview and then details are added later to give us more information, to fill in the blanks about how the parts all fit together. And sometimes some of those puzzle pieces are found in other books of the Bible, like the prophets Daniel and Ezekiel, and from Yeshua's words in the Gospels. Now, we previously studied the 7 letters to the 7 assemblies in chapters 2 and 3. And they are illustrated on the master menorah picture as the first mini menorah on the right. And then what we call the Shamash chapters. The Shamash is the center candle on a menorah, or the center lamp that's used to light the others. And so these Shamash chapters 4 and 5 prepared us for chapter 6, which is the second mini menorah with the 7 seals. Chapter 7 that we're going to look at today is the third Shamash chapter, which leads us to the opening of the 7th seal. Now, this opening of the 7th seal, which we will come to in chapter 8, will lead us directly into the third mini menorah and the next series of 7 events in chapters 8 and 9, which is the 7 trumpets. And just as the previous Shamash chapters introduced us to 2 of the primary participants of the future wedding of the Lamb, referring to the father of the groom, Yahweh, and the groom himself, Yeshua, chapter 7 will introduce us to more of the participants. Now, before we get into chapter 7, let me remind us of an important principle. We previously learned that in the book of Revelation, whenever there's a group of 7 judgments, there's a parenthesis or a parenthetical passage, an interlude, you might say, between the 6th and the 7th, where John changes the subject and then later comes back and deals with number 7. In the case of the 7 seals, after the first 6 seals that we studied last week in chapter 6, there is a whole parenthetical chapter. Chapter 7. And then when we come to seal number 7, which is in chapter 8, it will lead into the 7 trumpets. And then when we come to trumpet number 6, in chapter 9, verse 14, there's another parenthesis in chapters 10 and 11, before the 7th trumpet, which is in chapter 11, verse 15. And then we'll study chapters 11 through 14, before the 7 plagues, in chapter 15, and the 7 bowls of wrath in chapter 16. And even between the 6th and 7th bowls, there's a little 4-verse change of subject in chapter 16. Now, some scholars say that these events all are parallel with each other. all happening at the same time, while others say that they are sequential. And at this point in time, I lean that way. But it does appear that they are layered judgments, starting out small and ending up big, with each group of judgments worse than the previous group. Now, last week we studied the events that occur at the opening of the first 6 seals in the scroll in chapter 6, including the famous 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, along with a brief discussion of the Antichrist or Anti-Messiah. And we talked about the souls of the martyrs that John saw at the altar in heaven. And if you're interested in learning more about those things and you didn't catch last week's lesson, that lesson is now on our YouTube channel. I do want to repeat one quick point from last week's lesson for those of you who missed it, because I believe it's important. Many people claim that if we die before the resurrection of the dead, that we not only go into a state of physical death, but we go into a state of spiritual unconsciousness. Sometimes this is called soul sleep. And people who advocate that belief say that if we die, we are just completely unaware of anything until we are awakened at the resurrection. But John's description of the souls of the martyrs in heaven in Revelation chapter 6, verses 9 and 10, seem to paint a different picture. He said, when he, meaning Yeshua, had opened the 5th seal, I saw under the altar the souls of them that were slain for the word of God and for the testimony which they held. And they cried with a loud voice. They cried with a loud voice. These souls are not yet resurrected. They have died, but they haven't received their resurrected bodies, and yet they are conscious. They're not sleeping. They're not completely unaware of anything that's going on. They are interacting with God, crying out to Him with a loud voice, not only calling for vengeance, but also for His holiness to be vindicated and for His justice to be established, showing us that, just as Paul says in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 8, to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. Now let's get into this parenthetical chapter 7 between the 6th and the 7th seals. And we're going to take a look at the mysterious 144,000. These sealed servants of God, along with the multitude in heaven. And there's actually so much information that I have to share with you about the 144,000 that I'm going to split this teaching into 2 lessons. Part 1 today and part 2 next Sabbath. In this chapter, the focus shifts from the scenes of heaven that John has been watching back to earth, still taking place in the future, of course. In chapter 7, verse 1, John says, "And after these things I saw 4 angels standing on the 4 corners of the earth, holding the 4 winds of the earth, that the wind should not blow on the earth, nor on the sea, nor on any tree." Now these 4 angels are apparently the same 4 angels who will blow the first 4 trumpets in chapter 8. Standing on the 4 corners of the earth tells us that these angels are able, willing, and ready to affect the entire planet. And they are given this ability and this authority by God Himself. It was an ancient belief that winds which came from the north or the south or the east or the west were favorable, but that winds that blew diagonally were harmful. These 4 winds of the earth represent the destructive forces of God's judgment that these angels will use. But not yet. They're holding these winds of judgment back until the time is right. In verse 2, John says, "And I saw another angel ascending from the east, having the seal of the living God. And he cried with a loud voice to the four angels to whom it was given to hurt the earth and the sea." So this fifth angel has the seal of God, and we'll see in a moment what he's going to do with it. Now, seals have long been used since ancient times by kings and by property owners to show ownership, to show the source, to show authenticity or authority. And this angel cries to the four angels, and we see here that hurting the earth and hurting the sea, that's their assignment. And we'll see this take place when we get to the trumpets in chapter 8. Be assured that they are going to do a lot of hurting. Whatever protection that mankind has enjoyed in the past will be removed as the forces of nature are unleashed to deliver God's judgments upon the world. Many people don't realize it, but the Bible clearly shows that God sometimes uses weather and nature and natural disasters as instruments of his judgment. And it's also interesting that the four corners where these four angels stand may possibly be an allusion to the four corners of a tallit, or a prayer shawl, which symbolizes a place where God's power and authority are in force. A tallit is a covering, and it's associated with being in covenant with Yahweh. We might say that the Father is waiting for his covenant with mankind to be fulfilled, and that the Son is the one who makes this possible. We read several times in the Psalms about the safety and healing and comfort that are in his wings, such as in Psalm 17, verse 8. It says, "Keep me as the apple of the eye. Hide me under the shadow of your wings." Now, the Hebrew word for wings in these passages is kanaf. It's the same word that's used for corners, such as the corners of a tallit where the zitzit are. You know, when Yeshua came to Jerusalem for the last time before his crucifixion, he spoke of his desire to draw his people under the protective covering of his wings, even as a hen shelters her chicks. We read about it in Matthew 23, verse 37. He said, "How often would I have gathered your children together, even as a hen gathers her chickens under her wings." He was expressing his desire to bring us under the protection of his wings as part of his bride. And this protection includes healing, too, as we see in the story of the woman with this problem of chronic bleeding. She came crawling up behind Yeshua saying, "If I could just touch his garment, I'll be whole." And the parallel passage in Luke says that she touched the hem or the border of his garment. And that word for border or hem is the same word for corners, referring to his zitzit, as you see in that picture. She knew by faith that there was healing in his wings, which are represented by the zitzit on the corners of his tallit. And she was doing the same thing that the ancient Hebrews did when they prayed and they drew their tallit up over their heads and they grabbed their zitzit, acknowledging the power and the authority of God. But here in Revelation chapter 7, God's protection is about to be withdrawn from the earth and the sea and the trees and from all the people who are not under his covering. The fifth angel with the seal of God tells the other four angels in verse 3, "Hurt not the earth, neither the sea, nor the trees, till we have sealed the servants of God in their foreheads." We've heard about the mark of the beast and how it will involve a mark on your right hand or in your forehead. And those who accept that mark are going to be in big trouble. But these servants of God also will have the mark of God in their foreheads. These four angels will be told, and I paraphrase, hold on guys, don't do anything just yet. We got to take care of something else first. There's this break in the action. A short time of calm in the earth. Like a brief intermission in the havoc that is caused by the opening of the sixth seal and the cataclysmic events that follow until this task of sealing certain people is carried out. Now, some people interpret these words, earth and sea and trees, as metaphors, as being symbolic of something else. But I believe that unless the literal meaning just doesn't make sense, the words in the Bible should be taken literally. These angels are being told to not hurt the earth or the sea or the trees, representing the damage that's going to come to the planet and every living thing on it unless they're protected. And it's not to happen until these servants of God are sealed in their foreheads, apparently for that protection from God's judgment. And it's not that they will be exempt from the time of judgments, but that they will be brought safely through it. Do you wonder what that seal might look like? Well, let me share one possibility with you. In the prophet Ezekiel's descriptions of his visions of the coming destruction in Jerusalem by the Babylonians, which took place in 586 BC, he described a similar protective seal that was given to the righteous before Jerusalem's judgment was carried out. And in his vision, someone, probably an angel, with ink was told to mark them for protection. We read in Ezekiel chapter 9, verse 4, Yahweh said unto him, go through the midst of the city, through the midst of Jerusalem, and set a mark upon the foreheads of the men that sigh and that cry for all the abominations that be done in the midst thereof. These were the good guys that he wanted to protect. And it's really interesting what the Hebrew word for the word mark is. It's the Hebrew letter Tav or Tav. Sometimes that letter V is pronounced as a W. Different people have different ideas about how that should be pronounced. That's why some people say Yahweh, other people say Yahweh. The one explanation that I think is probably good is that the W sound is the older sound and the V sound is the later sound. So this word for mark is that letter, Ta or Tav. It's the final letter of the Hebrew alphabet, and it means sign or mark. Now, Hebrew letters have been written in different ways at different times. The modern style of the Hebrew letters is pretty different from the older original style, and one of the older styles is called Paleo-Hebrew. It was originally, each character represented it was a picture of something. And do you know what this letter, Ta, looked like at the time of Ezekiel in Paleo-Hebrew? That's fascinating. Now, I'm not saying that this seal on the foreheads of these men in Ezekiel 9 or Revelation 7 is definitely a cross, but it could be involved with it. Now, having said all that, Revelation 14 verse 1 says that the Father's name is written on their foreheads. And what does his name look like in Hebrew? Maybe that's what we'll see on the foreheads of the men in Revelation, and the men in Ezekiel had the cross. We'll find that. Put that on the list of things to ask. Let's go on to verse 4. He says, "And I heard the number of them which were sealed, and there were sealed 144,000 of all the tribes of the children of Israel." So we learn here that these servants of God who were sealed in their foreheads are numbered, and there are exactly 144,000 of them. Now, who are these 144,000? And what will they do? Have you ever had somebody ring your doorbell, and you go to the door, and there's a guy with a white shirt and a black tie, and maybe a couple of guys dressed like that, and they claim to be part of the 144,000? Jehovah's Witnesses used to make the claim that 144,000 people, meaning all of the Jehovah's Witnesses, will go to heaven forever, and the rest will either live forever on the earth or else be annihilated.
Only the first time 44,000
Now, next time they ring your doorbell, you might ask them what tribe they're from. Usually they won't have any idea. And now that there are more than 144,000 Jehovah's Witnesses, now they say that only a select group of them goes to heaven. This is all ridiculous. Let's talk first about who they are. In verses 5 through 8, we are told that there were sealed 12,000 from each one of the 12 tribes of Israel. 12 times 12,000 is 144,000. And that's a number that is said to represent completeness or perfection. And notice that these 144,000 are all Israelites. Now, they're not all Jews. Many people get confused when you say not all Jews are Israelites, or not all Israelites are Jews, rather. There's a difference. Originally, Jews were the ones from the tribe of Judah. The Hebrew way of saying it is the Yehudim came from the tribe of Yehudah. The ones from the tribe of Reuben were Reubenites, and the ones from the tribe of Gad are Gadites, and the ones from the tribe of Levi are Levites, and then there's Benjamites and Danites and all kinds of ites. Jews are only one of the 12. Now, in modern times, the usage of the word has changed, and all the people who live in Israel these days are referred to as Jews, even though they're not necessarily all from the tribe of Judah. But originally, that's what the words meant, and that's how they were originally used. So, all 144,000 of these servants of God who get the seal on their forehead are Israelites. And this listing in this format, showing 12,000 from each tribe, may be given to emphasize this literal meaning of the number 144,000. It's not a symbolic number, and this number 140,000 is not representative of the Gentile Christian church. They're Israelites. And it's possible, not saying for sure, but possible that some of us Messianic or Hebrew roots believers who are biblical Israelites, at least in a spiritual sense, could also be included, because some of us may also be physical descendants of Jacob without knowing it. Now, do you see anything unusual about that list of the 12 tribes? Bingo. It's interesting that the tribes of Israel are listed in the Bible some 25 or so times, but each and every listing is slightly different from all the others, either in the order that the names are listed or in the names that are included. But there's almost always 12. Although in some of the lists, one or more of them are omitted. The tribe of Levi is frequently omitted. They didn't own land. Sometimes certain other tribes are omitted. And then sometimes Joseph is counted as one, and sometimes he's counted as two. Don't let this be a problem. There are different lists with variations because they serve different purposes and emphasizing different things. But in this particular list, the tribe of Dan is omitted, and both Joseph and Manasseh are listed, which is odd because the tribe of Joseph was divided between his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. Now we should probably understand Joseph here to be the tribe of Ephraim. We might say that Ephraim is hidden within Joseph on this list. But the tribe of Dan isn't listed at all. And why would that tribe be completely omitted? Well, here are some possible reasons. Jacob's dying speech in Genesis 49 described Dan as a serpent by the way, an adder or viper in the path that bites the horse's heels so that his rider shall fall backwards. This seems to indicate satanic influence. Also, Dan had trouble taking its own territory and even left it. We see that in Joshua 19 and Judges 18. Deborah said that Dan didn't even leave its ships in Judges 5. And in Judges 18, we see that Dan attacked and took over other cities and rebuilt one as the city of Dan. And that the tribe of Dan set up idols and their own priests in that new city. In 1 Kings 12, we see that the Israelites worshipped golden calves in that city of Dan. This is when the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom had separated, and the northern kingdom had cities that were designated of places of worship. Dan in the south and Bethel in the north. Dan is the tribe through which idolatry entered into the land. And according to Deuteronomy 29, idolaters' names are to be blotted out. Now this passage in Deuteronomy is important enough to look at it. Beginning in verse 8, first part of verse 18, and then skip to verses 20 and 21, it says, "Lest there should be among you man or woman or family or tribe whose heart turns away this day from Yahweh our God to go and serve the gods of these nations. Yahweh will not spare him, but then the anger of Yahweh and his jealousy shall smoke against that man, and all the curses that are written in this book shall lie upon him, and Yahweh shall blot out his name from under heaven, and Yahweh shall separate him unto evil out of all the tribes of Israel, according to all the curses of the covenant that are written in this book of the law." And yet, according to Genesis 49 verse 16, Dan will be involved with judging his people as one of the tribes of Israel in the last days. And according to Ezekiel chapter 48 verses 1 and 2, the tribe of Dan does receive its land inheritance in the millennium, the Messianic era when Yeshua rules for 1,000 years. So not being included in this group of 144,000 does not nullify God's promises. Even though Dan won't be sealed or protected during the Great Tribulation, the ones that survive will be allowed to participate in the last days' judgment of their people, and they will receive their inheritance. Mike, would you do me a favor, or Rob, you're closer, would you lower the temperature setting a couple of degrees? It's stuffy in here, isn't it? Thank you. So who are the 144,000? What will they do? These 144,000 are Israelites, but beyond that, there's no way to identify them until they're sealed. And it might seem like it would be exciting to be part of this group, but until God's seal is put on their foreheads and everybody knows for sure who they are, we can only speculate about their identities. Next Sabbath, I'm going to discuss another aspect of what they're going to do, one that is rarely discussed or even thought about, and I think you will find it to be a truly fascinating insight as to what the role of the 144,000 will be in the end times and how it will affect us who are believers in Yeshua. But before I close today, there is one other interesting suggestion about their identity that I want to explore with you briefly this week. And this suggestion comes from the book Lost in Translation, Volume 2, by John Klein and Adam Spears, who are the leaders of a Messianic congregation in Oregon. Now, as I stated earlier, these 144,000 are sealed for protection, to preserve them intact in spite of all the judgments of God that are going to come. And why? Because they have a very special purpose and calling. And a lot of ink has been used over the centuries speculating on who they are and why they've been chosen and what they've been chosen to do. These 144,000 have been called, among other things, Jewish witnesses for Christ, who will somehow spark this gigantic end times revival, yet nothing they are assigned to do brings on any revival. No great end times revival is prophesied anywhere in the Bible. Nowhere in this passage are they described as witnesses, or even that their primary job will be to witness. None of the prophetic sounding statements that we hear about the 144,000 being a huge throng of last minute witnesses for Yeshua are even remotely biblical. The Bible does not predict a great end times revival, but rather the opposite. A huge, massive apostasy or falling away of those who claim to be believers, but who fall prey to false teachers, false prophets, deceptive signs and wonders, and delusion. There is simply no evidence at all anywhere in Scripture to support the notion that the 144,000 have been assigned to witness to others. If they have, they're failures because nobody repents. We don't see any witnessing going on at all, at least maybe until Revelation 14, when there is an angel flying around that has the gospel to preach to them that dwell upon the earth. That's about all it says about that. None of these 144,000 are assigned to do anything like missionary work of any kind whatsoever. Their assignment is to do exactly what the ancient Hebrew groomsmen did at ancient Hebrew weddings, and what they still do. We need to be very careful about making assumptions and believing and teaching ideas that cannot be supported in the Bible. Some of the popular ideas about the book of Revelation, they're comforting and they're reassuring to those who believe in them, such as the idea that the 144,000 are Jewish witnesses to the unsaved people who remain on the earth after the rapture. But they're not called to do that at all. Now remember that these 144,000 are sealed in their foreheads, marking them as being owned by God and authorized by Him for a special purpose, which just has not yet been made clear. But they will be protected from God's judgments. And remember what I said earlier, that just as the previous Shamash chapters 4 and 5 introduced us to two of the primary participants of the future wedding of the Lamb, the father of the groom, Yahweh, and the groom himself, Yeshua. Maybe chapter 7 is introducing us to more participants. Again, this is just a suggestion by these two Messianic leaders in Oregon, but I think it has merit. Not saying it's for sure, but it could be. The idea is that now that Yeshua has been recognized as the groom, that he takes the next logical step and he picks out his groomsmen, just as it was done in the ancient Hebrew betrothal sequence. As the groom went away to prepare a place for his bride, he would select his groomsmen and he would give them authority to act on his behalf and to get things ready. And there were certain characteristics of these groomsmen. Hebrew grooms were they always selected for their groomsmen unmarried virgin men. These men always came directly from the groom's own people. And the groomsmen could also be called watchmen or bond servants who followed and served the groom and helped him prepare for the wedding. Now these 144,000 have not yet been called groomsmen in the Bible, and they won't be because that's a relatively modern term. So to try to verify that this suggestion has merit, we can look at what they do and we can compare that to the traditional role and function of groomsmen, both in the preparations for an ancient Hebrew wedding and during the ceremony itself. Now, Revelation chapter 7 doesn't tell us too much about all this. We'll see more of those ideas and details in Revelation chapter 14, so we'll go into those details when we get there. But again, the groomsmen are all from the groom's family. They are literally blood descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob with very specific responsibilities. They are not figurative or symbolic figures representing some other group of people. And the things that they're instructed to do in the book of Revelation correlates precisely to the traditional role of groomsmen in ancient Hebrew weddings.
Is there a specific number of groomsmen that they pick?
Anyone who has ever witnessed a traditional Hebrew or Jewish wedding, even in modern times, or even a Messianic or a Hebrew roots wedding, has probably seen the wedding couple and the rabbi or the minister standing under something called a huppah. The huppah is a covering that every traditional Hebrew bride and groom for centuries have stood under during the marriage ceremony. And they can be made in various ways, with the frame being made out of wood or metal or even plastic PVC pipe these days. And it can have fancy material. Or it can just be a tallit or two draped over a simple framework, or even just held over the bride and groom's head by the groomsmen. Now this word huppah means a covering, a veil, a protection. And it's related to the words kafar and kippur. And the idea is to cover, to make atonement. So the proper traditional position of the bride and the groom is always under the huppah. And the proper traditional position of all the guests is always in front of the huppah. And that seems to be what's going on in Revelation chapter 7, verse 9. It says, "After this I beheld, and lo, a great multitude which no man could number, of all nations and kindreds or tribes and people and tongues, stood before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed with white robes and palms in their hands." This multitude could be the wedding guests, not the bride. Guests at Hebrew weddings were always given white robes to wear before the wedding started. They were not even permitted to be there if they weren't clothed in white, just as the bride and the groom were. And traditionally, these white robes were provided for them at the door. The idea was that everyone in attendance should represent and support the concept of purity in marriage. And then, traditionally, the guests would throw down palm branches in front of the bride and the groom as an act of honor. So if this suggestion is correct, we've now been introduced to the father of the groom and the groom himself and to the groomsmen. Maybe we're starting to catch a glimpse of the preparations at the place where the wedding will occur, with the people beginning to assemble for the ceremony. And we can look forward to the blowing of the shofars and the trumpets, especially the last shofar that signals the groom coming for his bride. Now, as fascinating and as thought-provoking as this suggestion is, next Sabbath, I will share with you another completely different yet related aspect of the role and the task of the 144,000 from Bible passages that are not usually associated with them. And it will be an aspect that I think may even be more fascinating than this one, and one with an exciting and relevant prophetic significance for us.